Hey, it's Dan, and in this video we're going to install this Ohlins shock on this BMW S1000RR. This job's about a 3 out of 5 for difficulty. Should take you an hour, maybe an hour and a half to finish. It's really not hard, but the tricky part is you'll need to support the back end of the motorcycle without putting any weight on the swing arm. So there's a few different ways to do this. You could either jack it up from the bottom using something like a floor jack, or in my case I've actually suspended it from a ceiling. I ended up reinforcing my ceiling a while back so that I could more easily do this. I'm using a tie-down ratchet strap to lift up the motorcycle so that I don't put any weight on the swing arm, and that way the rear shock is free to come in and out. So you'll need a torque wrench that goes up to 100 Newton meters, a couple of ratchet wrenches, a 5/8 socket with a couple of extensions will be helpful, a T50 bit, an 18mm box wrench and an 18mm socket, a 27mm socket to remove the pivot nut here. You can either buy a BMW special tool to remove the castle nut on the right side of the pivot bolt, or I ended up using a flat blade screwdriver and I tapped it loose with a hammer. And then finally a large hex bit, or I ended up using my own special tool which I made out of a bolt and two nuts that I squeezed together, and these guys are 17mm size. So I was able to slide this in place and then use a socket or a box wrench to loosen and tighten that bolt. So we'll start by removing the back wheel. We'll also need to move the lower linkage out of the way to get access to the lower bolt. The shock itself is only held in place by two bolts. There's one up on the top, one down on the bottom, and access to it is actually pretty easy. The rear axle is held in place by just a 34mm nut, so we'll go ahead and remove that. These are torqued pretty hard, so you'll need a longer wrench to get that loose. So it's a nut and a washer. This is going to allow us to actually move the axle right through it, which will loosen up the wheel. It helps to actually lift up the back wheel just a little bit to reduce the friction on the axle. Then we're going to move the chain out of the way and then slide the wheel back. So with the back wheel out of the way, we have easy access to the lower links. We're going to remove this bolt here, which is held in place by the nut on the side. Don't think I've ever taken this out before, so I'll use a little bit of penetrating oil here just to make removal easier. We'll let it sit for a while and then we'll give it a go. So I've let the penetrating oil sit here for a little while. I was hoping to be able to get a socket around this nut, but there's not enough clearance for a socket and a wrench to get through without removing the exhaust, so I don't want to do that yet. What I'll try to do instead is hold this guy in place using a combination wrench or a box wrench and then get it from the other side. So the reason we're doing this step right now is to give us access to the lower bolt on the shock, which is right over here. If I move this link out of the way, I'll be able to use the socket to get the bottom bolt of the shock. So I'm just backing this guy out right now. So now with the lower link out of the way, I have easy access to the bottom bolt of the shock. I'll be able to loosen this guy up and then pull it out. So the bottom of the shock here is held in place by this one bolt. The left nut that's over here is going to be a 16mm, which is the same thing as a 5/8, so I'll just use a 5/8 socket. On the other side, it's actually a Torx bolt, which is a T50, so I'll hold it in place with a T50 on the other side, and then loosen it up over here with a 5/8. First off, I'll spray this down with some lube here, let it sit for a minute, and then I'll give it a try. And now I can just try to break it free here. This was seized down there pretty good, so I ended up using a breaker bar. Now that it's broken free, it should be pretty easy to finish up here. Okay, so we removed the bottom nut. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and loosen the top over here. The top is going to be a T50. And then finally, I'm going to lift up the swing arm a little bit. Really should come right out. So this is it right here. And now you can see that the shock is just floating. And then we'll just back this one out. Okay, so the right side is held in place by a nut that's strangely shaped like this. It's almost like a cam lobe. All right, so I've played around with this for just a little bit. There's just not enough clearance to get the shock out of there with the swing arm on the bike. So what I'll need to do is actually remove the swing arm, move it out of the way so that I can move the shock out. It's held in place by this bolt over here that goes all the way through the frame. So the first step here is going to be to loosen and remove this nut on the left side. Then we'll go to the right hand side and then back it out. All right, so the left side is a 27 millimeter. I'll use a socket to get that loose. You know, having a breaker bar like this really makes these jobs much easier, especially if the bolts have not been loose in a while. Okay, so this is a lock nut with a washer. So the right side's a little more tricky. There's this little castle nut that's holding this guy in place. Now, ideally, I would have a socket that'll fit this. It's a BMW special part. I don't have that right now. I don't want to wait for the part to come in, so what I'll try to do is actually use one of the notches and then tap it out with a flat blade screwdriver. Usually that should be okay. I'm going to spray some lube on the threads here just to make it a little bit easier on me. Then we'll give it a try. Okay, so now that we have the castle nut loose, the last step is going to be to back out this bolt. I don't have a hex wrench large enough to fit this guy, but I do have a homemade tool from a previous installation, which is just a bolt with two nuts. I ended up putting a lot washer right in between them, tightening the nuts on the other side, which then allows me to back this in and use it as a special tool. So I'll be able to slide this in place here, and then just use a socket wrench or another wrench to loosen this guy up. So here, I will need to support the swing arm. And also the shock, so take your time here. Actually, to make things a little bit easier on myself, I'm going to put the top bolt through the shock here, just so I don't have to worry about that falling through. So now I just really want to make sure that I can hang on to the swing arm. And the swing arm is free to go. So next up, I'm going to just move this guy out of the way. I don't need to take it completely off the bike. There's too many things attached to it. I just want to give myself enough clearance to pull out the shock. So now that we're ready for the installation of the replacement part, I want to make a quick note. So Ohlins only supports the more recent model years, which means that brand new suspension components from them are not available for this model year at this point anymore. I ended up finding a used part. I had it serviced. If you go the same route here, make sure that you service it by somebody who's an authorized dealer and knows what they're doing. They'll be able to set it up for your bike, for your body weight, for your riding style, and also make sure that everything is in working order. So now I have high confidence that this is working properly. I can go ahead and put it on the bike, and I know it's going to work. So we're going to install this the same way that the old one came out, which means it's going to go into the bike this way. And I'll do the same thing as I did before. I'll put the shock in first. just hang it by the bolt, then get the swing arm back in place, and then I'll be able to tighten the remaining components. Okay, so just take your time here. Make sure that you align the holes first. Don't force this guy in place. There's a thread at the end, so you don't want to damage that in any way. Support that with your hand. And then once it's aligned, you'll be able to push it all the way through and then tighten it back up. So it's easier to do if you could see the other side. It's aligned on the left. And now we can work it in. Okay, so try to align it kind of the same distance as you had it before. So before I know I backed it out one turn, so I want to have enough thread here to tighten it about one more turn. So we'll give it just a little bit more. And then for the next step, we're going to use the same process. We'll tap it in with the screwdriver just to tighten up the nut. And we'll torque the other side. So next up, I'll go ahead and replace this in the same order. So it's a washer, followed by the lock nut. Always start it by hand. And this is a 27mm socket here. So I'll tighten it just to hold it in place for the time being. After everything is back in place, including the top and the bottom bolts for the shock, I'll go ahead and torque it to the proper spec. So next up, I'll replace the nut that holds the top of the shock. So remember, I slid this in place just to make it easier to install the swing arm. So I'll back up the bolt here. This is going to be the T50. So you want to hold that nut in place with your index finger over on the right hand side here, and then start it by hand. Okay, so the top is loosely in. Now we'll do the bottom. Okay, so I've got all the bolts in place. I've got the top bolt for the shock. I got the bottom bolt of the shock, and also the lower linkages is in place as well. So next up is going to be to torque everything. Make sure not to forget about torquing the swing arm pivot bolt, and then we'll put the rear wheel back on. So the torque for the pivot bolt is 100 Newton meters. We'll torque the top shock bolt to 50 Newton meters. And we'll torque the bottom nut to about 50 Newton meters. This is a 5/8 size socket. I do have a wrench holding it in place on the other side. And now that we have the bottom of the shock torqued, we're going to go ahead and put the last bolt back in. This is for the linkages. Remember, this was in the way of the shock before, so don't put this in until your shock is torqued to the right values. And here, it'll slide right in. You'll just need to support the frame or the swing arm just at the right angle here. And then we'll tighten this up. So always start these by hand. And this will be an 18 millimeter size. So I've got an 18 millimeter box wrench for my nut and an 18 millimeter socket here on this side. And then finally, we'll also torque this guy to about 50 Newton meters. Now, I know I'm torquing the wrong side here, but there's just not enough clearance for a socket on the right-hand side, so this is all I can do. Okay, so now that we've got everything torqued up, it's time to put the rear wheel back on. With this step, it could be a little bit tricky if you're not used to it, so take your time. Make sure that you insert the rear rotor right between the pads. Make sure that the rear caliper is still on the rail that it's supposed to be on. Make sure that you don't lose any of the bushings or the spaces that are on the right and left side of the wheel. Just take your time to work it in, loop the chain around the sprocket, and then adjust the chain and tighten everything up. So take your time, be patient. Sometimes this step could be a little tricky. And then we've got the washer followed by the lock nut. Now before you tighten up the rear axle, make sure that your chain slack is where it needs to be. Mine's already set correctly. Now we're going to torque this to 100 Newton meters. So this is a 34 millimeter socket. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.